The dog stopped first. She had been moving with the patrol all night. Quiet, reliable, trained for exactly this kind of darkness. But somewhere in the middle of the block, she locked up, all four legs planted into the dust. Her body went rigid, and she would not move. The soldiers looked at each other. No words. That was the protocol. Noise discipline. But they communicated with their eyes, the way men do after enough time in combat. Something ahead. Check your sector. Stay tight. One of them raised his night vision optic and scanned the street. The street was empty. The houses were empty. The entire neighborhood had been empty for months. That much was known. That much was expected. But what the soldier saw through that optic, or more precisely, what he almost saw, would stay with him for the rest of his life. Not because of what was there, because of the way it moved before disappearing. If you appreciate long-form documentary storytelling rooted in real military history, we invite you to consider subscribing. It helps us continue producing this kind of serious, research-driven work. Now back to Iraq. By 2004, the United States Army had been in Iraq for just over a year. The initial invasion, swift, overwhelming, and broadly successful in its conventional military objectives, had given way to something far more complex. The insurgency had taken root. Forward operating bases were expanding across the country's central and western provinces, and American infantry units found themselves responsible for vast stretches of terrain they had never trained to occupy long-term. The Anbar Province, the outskirts of Baghdad, the Sunni Triangle. These were not the open desert of the Gulf War. These were urban and semi-urban environments, dense neighborhoods, irrigation-fed palm groves, crumbling industrial districts, and in some areas, entire towns that had been evacuated during the fighting and never resettled. Night operations were standard. They were, in many ways, preferred. American forces carried a significant technological advantage in darkness: thermal imaging, night vision optics, satellite coordination. The doctrine of the time held that U.S. forces owned the night. Commanders used this phrase without irony. It was operationally accurate. American units could move, communicate, and engage in conditions where opposing forces were largely blind. A typical infantry squad on a nighttime patrol in 2004 was operating on somewhere between 4 and 6 hours of sleep. The heat, which regularly reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit during the day, dropped considerably after midnight, making the hours between 0100 and 0400 the most tactically suitable window for movement. Patrols would push out from their FOBs, walk prescribed routes through designated sectors, establish observation points on rooftops, monitor road intersections for IED emplacers, and return before first light. It was grinding, repetitive work. Soldiers described the psychological weight of it not as fear, though fear was present, but as a kind of sustained compression. Every doorway was a potential threat. Every shadow had to be assessed. Every noise required a decision. The military kept detailed records of these patrols. Route reports, radio logs, after-action reviews. The paper trail from this period is substantial, but official records do not fully match lived experience. It is not unusual for soldiers to talk, especially at night, in the hours before patrol or the hours after one, when the adrenaline is still burning and sleep won't come. War generates stories the way heat generates mirages. Most experienced veterans will tell you that. But within several units operating in Iraq between 2003 and 2006, a specific category of story began to circulate. Not stories of combat, not stories of close calls with IEDs or sniper fire. Those stories were common currency, traded openly, almost casually. These stories were different. They were told quietly, sometimes only to one or two other people, and they shared a pattern that became harder to dismiss the more accounts were collected. Soldiers described seeing things at night that did not fit the operational environment. Not enemy combatants, not civilians. Something else. Something at the edges of patrols, moving in ways that did not correspond to human movement. Reports described a presence that appeared in spaces that had already been cleared. Something that was observed through night vision but produced no heat signature on thermal imaging. One account, collected anonymously from a veteran who served in a northern Baghdad district, described a shape that moved alongside his unit's patrol formation for several minutes before anyone noticed it. He recalled it as a solid shadow. His words, not an interpretation. A shape that had dimension, had apparent mass, but produced no sound. He said, the rest of the squad saw it too. Similar observations were reported across unrelated groups in different sectors by men who had no contact with one another. To understand what soldiers believed they were encountering, it helps to understand the cultural and spiritual landscape of Iraq. The concept of the Jinn is ancient. It appears in the Quran, in pre-Islamic Arabian tradition, and in folk belief systems that predate the written historical record. The word itself translates roughly to the hidden or the concealed. In Islamic theology, the Jinn are a category being created from smokeless fire, distinct from humans, distinct from angels, capable of existing in the visible and invisible world simultaneously. They are not metaphorical. Across the Muslim world, and certainly in Iraq, they are understood as real. Local Iraqi civilians, interpreters, sheiks, village elders, did not hesitate to explain certain phenomena through this framework. When American soldiers, bewildered by something they could not categorize, asked their interpreters what they might have seen, the response was often the same. Be careful near old places, near ruins, near cemeteries, near abandoned villages. The world's largest cemetery, Wadi Islam, the Valley of Peace, sits near Najaf in central Iraq. It holds the remains of more than 5 million people. Grave diggers who work there regularly report encounters that leave them, in their own words, shaken. This is documented. This is part of the cultural fabric of the country American forces were occupying. There is a pattern in the military accounts that aligns, whether intentionally or not, with the traditional behavioral characteristics attributed to Jinn in Islamic folk belief. The encounters tend to occur in abandoned or contested spaces. They involve a presence that observes but does not attack. They leave witnesses in a state of disorientation rather than injury, and they cease when dawn approaches. The accounts also share one detail that contradicts the simplest psychological explanations. Multiple witnesses, in the same place, at the same time, reporting the same thing independently. That detail is set aside here. Without further examination, the first documented account of this nature from the Iraq War period that circulated beyond a single unit came from soldiers stationed near a district described as a ghost town, a residential neighborhood that had been evacuated during the initial fighting and never repopulated. Streets with sidewalks remained. Houses stood intact. Some still had furniture visible through broken windows. But no one lived there. No one had lived there in months. American forces were assigned to patrol it regularly. The strategic logic was sound. Empty buildings were staging grounds for insurgent activity, and denying the enemy access to them was a priority. One sergeant, a veteran of multiple deployments who had seen close-range combat in the same sector, organized a squad into a modified wedge formation and moved them to the ghost town on a night that, by all operational accounts, was routine. No intelligence indicated elevated threat. Radio traffic was quiet. Somewhere in the middle of that patrol, a soldier at the rear of the formation made a sound. Not a word at first, more of an involuntary vocalization. Then, what the hell is that? He pointed into the interior of the formation, not outward, not toward the rooftops or the alleyways, but inward, toward his own squad. Then he ran, in a combat zone. At 0200 in the morning, he dropped his weapon and ran, alone, in the dark, away from his unit. a trained infantryman who had functioned under fire. He ran. Those who turned to look where he had been pointing saw something moving with them inside the formation, a shape that was described across multiple independent recollections in nearly identical terms. Tall, narrow, with disproportionately long arms. A silhouette that had no business existing inside a cleared patrol route. It turned its head, as if aware it had been seen. The official after-action report from that night noted the soldiers' unauthorized deviation from formation. It recommended a counseling session. It did not mention what the rest of the unit reported seeing. The consequences of that night were not disciplinary. They were quieter than that. That squad never patrolled the ghost town at full depth again. Their sergeant led them to the edge, and they waited. The academic and clinical literature on wartime perceptual anomalies is substantial. Sleep deprivation is among the most well-documented causes of perceptual disturbance in humans. Infantry soldiers in Iraq during the 2004 to 2006 period regularly operated on consolidated sleep cycles of 4 hours or fewer. Sleep debt of this magnitude, sustained over weeks or months, produces measurable effect on the visual and auditory cortex. The brain begins filling in gaps in perception with pattern-generated imagery. Familiar shapes, human silhouettes, become the most common projection. This is not hallucination in the clinical sense. It is the brain doing exactly what it evolved to do, in conditions it was never designed to sustain. Hypervigilance compounds this. A soldier who has spent weeks assessing every shadow for threat potential trains their brain to find patterns where none exist. The technical term is apophenia, the tendency to perceive meaningful connections in unrelated stimuli. Under sustained operational stress, it becomes constant. The terrain contributes as well. Iraq's semi-arid landscape, the persistent dust, the thermal layering that occurs in the hours before dawn. These create atmospheric conditions that distort what the eye perceives. Mirages are not limited to daylight. In the hours after midnight, when ground temperature drops rapidly while the air above retains heat, light can bend in ways that are genuinely difficult to account for. These factors explain many reports. Researchers and military psychologists will say as much directly, but they do not fully account for the cases where multiple soldiers, scanning independently with different equipment, report the same specific detail in the same specific location at the same specific moment. And they do not explain the thermal imaging results. The account that follows was originally posted on a moderated online forum for military veterans. It has been cross-referenced, and details within it align with the known operational geography of northern Baghdad in 2005. The man who wrote it served as a radio operator. He has only told this story, by his own account, to a small number of people. He described a night in which his shift on radio watch ended at approximately 0250. He walked down from his position to a small latrine structure, a cinder-block enclosure, near the base of a hillside. Standard, routine. He heard footsteps, not shuffling, not the sandale movement of the local guards he had spent months learning to recognize. These were deliberate boot steps, the sound of a soldier moving in full combat gear, with a specific percussion of metal hardware on a load-bearing vest. He knew that sound. He had heard it thousands of times. He looked up the hill. There was no one there. He waited. The footsteps did not stop. They continued up the incline alongside him, regular in rhythm, deliberate in pace, for approximately 30 seconds. Then they stopped. He remained in the latrine for some time after that. He did not go back up the hill immediately. When he wrote about it later, he did not describe fear in the way a person might dramatize it. He described it in the language of a man still trying to process a mechanical problem, something that happened that had inputs and outputs, but no logical through line. He wrote that he had spent years in Iraq. He had heard weapons fire at close range. He had sat with wounded men. He was, in his own estimation, not easily rattled. He was rattled. A researcher reviewing this account noted one specific detail. The latrine structure where the event occurred had been built over the site of a former Iraqi military installation. Structures from that installation had been demolished during the initial U.S. advance. The ground had been repurposed without full excavation of what lay beneath. The researcher raised the observation without conclusion. So will we. What makes these accounts genuinely difficult to dismiss is not any single report. It is the clustering. A Marine Corps sniper attached to a quick reaction force in Fallujah in 2004 described a moment during a rooftop observation post in which his team spied a figure on the street below. Clear line of sight. A confirmed engagement was called. The shot was taken. Clean impact. Visually confirmed. The QRF moved to the location 20 minutes later. There was nothing there. No body. No blood. No material evidence of any kind. The ground around the strike point was undisturbed. A second veteran, unconnected to first, operating in a different sector, reported an almost identical sequence of events during a small kill team ambush near an IED hotspot. Different unit, different year, different part of the country. The figure was confirmed through optics. The engagement was logged. The follow-up found nothing. Both men noted the same thing in recounting the experience. They were not believed. Both had their reports quietly absorbed into the radio log and never formally reviewed. From Afghanistan, a different war, a different terrain, a different cultural context, a similar pattern emerged in reported accounts. Soldiers on night watch near a patrol base described rocks being thrown at them from an open field. When they put on night vision, the field was empty. When they switched to infrared thermal imaging, there were no heat signatures. The rocks continued. In another account, a soldier described two figures standing on a berm approximately 200 meters from his vehicle, motionless, with their backs turned. The interpreter was asked what was happening. He gave what the soldier described as a blank stare and said nothing. The lieutenant ordered the patrol to close the distance. 20 minutes later, he returned to the vehicle with what was described as a weird look on his face. He said, "We're out of here." No one asked him to elaborate until later that day. By then, he had little to say. Different units, different locations, same sounds, same behaviors, same outcomes. The pattern is difficult to articulate without stating it plainly. These men encountered something they could not classify, and across all of them, the institutional response was the same. The report was logged. The column moved on. No one came back to look. It would be irresponsible to present these accounts without genuine engagement with the available rational explanations. And there are several that deserve serious consideration. The first is psychological. Dr. Anthony Feinstein of the University of Toronto, a psychiatrist who has spent decades studying the mental health effect of combat, has noted that traumatized individuals can experience dissociative episodes, moments in which perception becomes genuinely altered. These are not psychotic breaks. They are the brain's response to overwhelming sustained stress. In his words, a person who has been traumatized can have abnormal perceptual experiences without being mentally ill, without being unreliable, and without any awareness that what they are perceiving departs from reality. This explanation works for many individual accounts. It works less cleanly when multiple soldiers in the same formation, none of whom spoke during the observation period, report identical visual details in independent debriefs. The second explanation is environmental. Iraq's atmosphere, particularly in the pre-dawn hours, creates optical conditions that can produce convincing visual distortions. Dust suspended at specific altitudes bends light in ways that can generate apparent silhouettes with apparent movement. Infrared reflections from residual heat sources, concrete, metal debris, electrical cabling, can produce reading anomalies on thermal equipment. This explanation handles a significant portion of the thermal imaging discrepancies. It does not handle the sounds. The third explanation is acoustic. War zones accumulate an enormous density of materials: steel, concrete, rebar, underground infrastructure that conduct and redirect sound in ways that would not occur in civilian environments. Footsteps from a distant location can be channeled through underground pipes or structural corridors to appear as though they're originating from an adjacent surface. The auditory system, particularly under sleep deprivation, is poorly equipped to triangulate such redirected sound. This is a credible explanation, except that the soldier who heard the boots on the hillside stood still for 30 seconds. The footsteps moved continuously alongside him. The direction of origin did not waver. It tracked. Every rational explanation almost works. Almost. The account that follows is the most complete, the most corroborated, and the most difficult. It comes from a soldier who was part of a unit conducting regular night patrols through the ghost town district referenced earlier. He was not the soldier who ran. He was one of the soldiers who remained. By this point in their deployment, the unit had developed an informal understanding about the ghost town. The new commanding officer, practical, skeptical of anything that couldn't be put in a report, had ordered continued patrols. The squad complied, but the patrols had changed shape. They moved slower. They stayed close to structures. They did not push deep into the interior streets. One night, they pushed deep. The account does not explain why. The soldier writing it says only that it happened, that there was a reason, some tactical directive, that compelled them to move through the central blocks rather than around them. The reason was ordinary. The outcome was not. The soldier described moving through a street flanked by 2 rows of empty residential buildings. The scout dog, the same dog referenced in other accounts, or one like her, had been reluctant to enter. She moved when commanded, but kept pulling against her handler's pace. Midway through the block, the dog stopped entirely. The formation held. The soldier looked forward and saw nothing. He looked left. He looked right. He looked up at the roof lines with his optic. He scanned methodically, the way he had been trained, the way he had done hundreds of times. Then he noticed a British colonial-era structure at the end of the block. It had been a fortification once. Firing ports cut into the walls, low towers at each corner, the bones and administration from a century before. It had been used, in recent years, by no one. There was a shape in one of the firing ports. Not a soldier, not a man. Something that fit within the rectangular opening but did not fill it. Something that was present in the way a person is present when they're watching from a window. Still, upright, oriented toward the patrol. The soldier described what happened next carefully, because he understood that careless description would undermine the account. He raised his night vision optic to port. The shape was there. He switched to thermal. The port was cold. He held the optic on the port for what he estimated as 20 seconds. The shape did not move. The thermal return did not change. Cold stone, cold air, nothing warm, nothing metabolic. He lowered the optic. The shape was gone. He did not say anything to the soldier next to him. The soldier next to him said, "Did you see that?" They held position for a moment longer. The patrol frozen behind them. The dog still locked at the handler's leg. Then the sergeant gave the hand signal. Withdraw. No words. No radio. Just a flat palm moving backward, low and deliberate. They moved out of the ghost town at a pace that was not quite a run, but was not a patrol. Nobody spoke until they were back inside the wire. The soldier who wrote this account described sitting down after the debrief and trying to find the logic in what he had observed. Thermal imaging doesn't lie, he wrote. It reads heat. It reads biological metabolism. A living human body at rest produces a detectable signature at 30 meters, at 20, at 10. There's no training scenario, no equipment malfunction, No atmospheric interference that eliminates a warm body from a thermal camera at 20 feet. The port had been cold. Whatever was in it produced no heat. He wrote the account down years later and closed it with one sentence. He wrote, "I don't know what we saw. I know what we didn't see. And I know the difference." There's a word in Arabic, al-gaib, that translates roughly as the unseen world. It is a theological concept, present in the Quran, used to describe the domain of existence that lies adjacent to the visible and knowable. It is not a metaphor. It is a sincere ontological claim that there's more here than what we can measure. American soldiers who served in Iraq were not, as a category, a credulous population. They were trained in systematic observation. They were taught to document, to report, to rely on what instruments confirmed rather than what instinct suggested. The military culture of the era was deeply skeptical of anything that couldn't be mapped or briefed, and yet accounts like these accumulated, quietly, in the spaces between after-action reports, passed between men who trusted each other enough to say, "Something happened that I cannot explain." The clinical literature offers frameworks: sleep deprivation, hypervigilance, dissociation, pattern recognition under stress. These are legitimate, evidence-based explanations for a significant portion of what soldiers reported. Researchers who study the psychology of combat do not dismiss them, but there's a particular kind of honesty that belongs to men who have functioned under lethal pressure, who have learned to read their environment with a precision most people never develop. When those men say, "I know the difference between a malfunctioned perception and an observation that holds," it is worth pausing before answering them. The ghost town in that district of Iraq still stands, as far as available records indicate. The British colonial fortification at the end of the block is still there. The firing ports face the same direction. The neighborhood is still largely unpopulated. Nobody has gone back to look. Whether that is prudence or avoidance is not something this documentary can determine. What remains is the memory, the silence at the end of a patrol, the hand signal, palm flat, moving backward, slow and deliberate, and the dog, still locked in position, looking at something no thermal camera would ever confirm. Some things in wartime are not resolved by the units that encounter them. They are simply left behind, carried home in the spaces between what soldiers say and what they can prove. That distance between what was observed and what can be explained is where this account lives and where it will remain.